we can run through some questions, but if, like I said, I'm not real set on any one direction of where this all goes. So,
Okay.
All right. So, art's been a major part of your life for so long now.
Yep.
Through your teaching and through your own personal work that you do. Where for you does this journey with art begin?
Oh, probably when I was about 8 years old, something like that. I've just always drawn. I was raised on a resort in northern Wisconsin, just below the upper Michigan border. So there was a lot to look at and draw. So it was a little tiny town, smaller than this. And then from there I went to Chicago to go to college. And then from there I went to the University of Hartford in Connecticut to the Hartford Art School. And then from there I came to Olivet. So...
So, when you were younger, was there any one person that you felt like had a pretty big influence on, like, who you ended up becoming?
Not really. I mean, other than my parents. And of course my siblings. I'm the oldest of 7. So, just kind of an average. The reason I ended up, this is a strange thing, but the reason I ended up in art school in Chicago, one of the guests at the resort was an engineer who built motors for push boats on the Mississippi. And he really pushed me to go to Illinois Institute of Technology because it was an engineering school, and that's where he went. And he really pushed for that. So I ended up there and realized, my goodness, they have an amazing art school. So sort of happenstance, but it's not like I was on a track and just ended up there without any choice. It was just, I could have gone in different ways, but the one interesting thing about that school, which is an engineering school, is that they insisted that general education was incredibly important. It benched basically a second liberal arts degree. And that's one of the reasons Olivet clicked with me.
Do you remember, like as a kid, what you wanted to be growing up at all?
Lots of different things. It was something that at the time I kind of thought I'd just hang around that little town because it was so beautiful. I mean, the city itself of Minocqua was an island, and that's where the school and the town was, but then you couldn't go 4 miles in any direction without bumping into a lake. And it was just forest and a great place. So most of the time I just assumed that's where I'd spend my life. Didn't turn out that way, but...
How do you think your childhood self would feel about where you ended up going with everything?
Surprised. I guess my life is just sort of a whole series of unplanned things and accidents. But, I mean, I always liked to draw. It was something that was very visual. I did work, unfortunately for him, I did work for a sign painter when I was in high school. Ruined a lot of truck doors and things like that. But my father thought that would be a very good living. to be a sign painter, because in those days, a lot, especially there, a lot of the signs were hand painted, even big billboards. But I did that until I went off to college.
So in terms of the art you make, can you describe your creative process?
Well, it's basically two-dimensional. Painting, printmaking, drawing. My actual undergraduate degree is in graphic design. They didn't actually have fine arts degrees at where I went for an undergraduate. But because it was part of what I mentioned earlier, the Bauhaus, which was one of the most experimental and influential art schools in the world at the time. It started out in Germany in the 20s. And the school itself produced amazing furniture makers, architects, painters, textile artists. Hitler finally closed it down, and the remnants of it came to the United States. And then from there, a big chunk of it went to Chicago, which is where I went. But the thing about that was that it was very open, very broad. You could be a realist, you could be a total abstract artist. Any of those things would have been comfortable at that school. And they influenced graphic design, architecture, painting, sculpture. So much came, in terms of modern art, came from that place. I ended up, because of just making art on my own as a kid, I ended up basically being a realist. But because of that education at that art school, the most important thing for me as an artist, but also as a teacher, is the idea of composition and color. So that covers everything. I mean, you can be a total abstract artist, or you can be a super photographic realist. And it's still, composition is so relevant. I think the guiding spirit of art of any kind, I mean, even when you're talking about music or literature, visual art, it all has to do with how human beings, the human mind, controls it, frames it, sets it up. Because art and life aren't quite the same. So what you do with art, it's how you set it up, what kinds of forms and patterns you use to create something which then means something to an audience. And that, to me, was a pretty good place to come from to be a teacher. So you can deal with different students, different tastes, and the kinds of things that they are interested in. It's much more important in my mind to try to meet them as much as you can to where they are, what they want, where they're coming from.
So from what I've seen of your work and everything, it seems to extend many mediums. So
yeah.
What draws you to different forms?
Well, because as a kid, I basically had pencils and crayons, things like that. So it was pretty limited, and paper. But as you got into things like art school, they introduced you to different kinds of mediums. And you learned all about these kinds of materials and different kinds of things that you can do with them. None of which, well, I mean, if you just specialize in one particular one, you could go in a narrow way pretty far. But I think the idea for me, and I think for a lot of people living today, the idea of variety and choice and different kinds of possibilities is really important. So having that kind of breadth available to you is something that, to me, was always useful and pleasant. Something I encourage in other people, students. The reason I stayed at Olivet for 45, I taught it for 45 years here. And the reason is because it was small. So you can relate to your students. I mean, you get to know them in a way where it's not just from a lecture stand. You know, you're talking to a lot of people in a very abstract way. To me, that was very fulfilling. I pretty much keep in touch with a lot of students, you know, that some 40 years ago and some 3 years ago. And it's nice because you develop a relationship that's not just cut and dried, formal, here's a fact and here's what you do with it kind of thing. And I think a lot of the faculty and even a lot of the administrators at small colleges really, it's rewarding. I mean, they really enjoy it in a way that translates to longevity. You know, they're there for a while. Now, for some faculty, this, you know, it's a small place, it's isolated, and they want bigger things, so they're here a couple years and they go on. But there's always been a core, I'd say, especially at Olivet, somewhere between, not half, but certainly more than a quarter of the faculty each one's been here a long time for that same reason. So I think in that environment, the idea of learning in that kind of an environment is something that I think you get, there's more layers. You get more out of it than just the actual formal content of any given course. It's something that you can do when you're in smaller classes. You can't do it when you've got 80 in a class or something.
So, sort of on that teaching note, how would you have described your teaching style?
Well, obviously there are things that are important to me, you know, philosophies of kinds of things. And as I said, composition is really, to me, it's sort of paramount. It's so basic to everything that is something I try to, in every class I teach, whatever the medium is, it's something that I really try to get across to students. One of the things about teaching art is the fact that it's not like I give out information and they give it back to me on tests or something. They're making things. And in the process of making things, they're making it and I'm with them while they're making it. Obviously they work on things beyond the class, but we have in all the classes a system of critiques. So once you've gotten a piece fairly far along, that's sort of, in terms of time, you end it there and start another one after that, but you end it with a critique and you talk about it and you essentially ask everyone to talk about their own work and to talk about each other's work, which in itself is interesting because most people, when you start out with something like that, you get a little nervous about saying something about someone else's work other than stereotypical, oh, that's nice kind of thing. But once they get beyond that, they start to feel comfortable talking about their own work and talking about other people's work. But that whole process is something where you have to think about it. You can't just say, okay, I made it, that's it, it's done. It's something that you think about, and for most of them, they thought it was done at the critique, and then later on they go back and they change things. So that you get people like major artists like, say, Cézanne or Degas, whose work hangs at a museum and they'll try to sneak in and change something. You know, the museum owns it. So it's a process, and that whole idea of process is very, very important. And again, that links up to general education and liberal arts education, where you talk about, let's say you're talking about, well, that picture up there on the wall, that's an artist, Martin Hubbard from Battle Creek. That is inside of his old studio in Battle Creek, and that's the old train station behind the window. But every work of art, even abstract art, has content. And the content is something that you have to bring to art. And it has to do with what you know, what you've learned, what you've read, what you've seen. And that becomes, again, like general education. It becomes something that informs whatever it is you're doing for your life, you know, whatever you're making, whether it's a good or a service.
So let's see. From the beginning of your time, you said 45 years. From the beginning of your time as a professor at Olivet to the end, and even till now, because you're still active and like you're even going to the one exhibit tonight.
Right.
What would you say you've seen is the biggest change?
Well, the school's gotten a little bigger, not a lot, but it has gotten a little bigger. One of the things that I see as a change, and I'm still not completely certain it's a good thing or a bad thing, but in higher education in general, there is a sense of a career. What am I going to do at college that will give me a career once I'm out? And I think given the cost of higher education, everyone has to think like that, think about it. But the problem is, how much of that thinking do you allow to take over as a student, and your thinking and what you do with what that school offers you? You can't take every course that's at the school. You'd be here the rest of your life, even at Olivet. But the thing that I get nervous about, it's happened even at Olivet, but that idea of what am I going to do? How much money am I going to make? Given what it costs me, both in terms of time and money, to me, what's important, and it's very hard to put that pressure on students, is to not let that completely take over, where I know I just want to sell insurance. So I'm just going to, I don't want to take anything else other than everything that will focus into that. Because in the end, I think the idea of something, this vague thing called liberal arts, which talks about philosophy and sociology and history and politics, all of that to a certain degree is something that everybody needs to have in one guise or another, some more, some less. But to me, that's one of the most valuable things that goes beyond high school, and it's something that colleges do. What's happening in a lot of places now, especially in larger universities, are things like literature are being shrunken down in favor of courses that are more career-oriented. And to me, that is something that, at the moment in a student's mind probably makes some sense, but later on, there's a price to be paid in terms of how broad are you? How much can you really think? What allows you to make really important choices? I mean, whether it's something like who you vote for, or where you give money to, all of those things have, in the end, you later in life, you're having to make all kinds of decisions. And if you're pretty narrow in what you've allowed yourself to be exposed to, that, I think, limits you later on, and there is a price to be paid.
So another one of kind of a change question. You on your first year teaching compared to you at year 45, what changes about how you teach?
I think most teachers would say this, high school teachers, college teachers, the more you teach and the more individuals you meet, and you have no idea, you cannot predict all the things you're going to encounter just in terms of your students. And the more experience you have, both the more comfortable you are in doing that, the more you realize what you know and what you don't know, or what you should know. So all teachers, in a sense, are teaching, but they're also learning. And they're learning along with their students. They're learning how to teach. In some ways, it's just like applied psychology. How do you convince someone to come to class? And try to get them to see, not by yelling at them, but by trying to get them to see that what's in that class is valuable and useful. So when I first started teaching, my focus was all on the content, what was there for me to give to students, what they were there for, why they were there to learn. But then the idea of teaching someone isn't just telling them something. It's figuring out different ways that they can understand it. And I guess students are people, they're different. So you end up learning about, I guess, selling and convincing people about the kinds of stuff that's in your course. And you learn it from other teachers, you learn it from more material you learn it from your students. And the more you learn, the better you can do, the better job you can do.
You kind of mentioned it there, but can you think of any moments or times where you felt like the students were teaching you?
Oh, all the time. There's a lot of work on the walls and all over the house, student work that to me is wonderful. And I think in some ways they've done things that I think was more important than they could realize when they did it. I mean, it was really a wonderful thing. Now here, let me get this one piece. This is an example of a student in a painting class. And this was in her senior show, and I bought it. But as a landscape, both the composition, the color, the brushwork, this was a pretty amazing accomplishment by, I don't know, she was like 22, 23, something like that. Her name was Tammy Rockefeller. I think her hometown was Mason, which is around Lansing. And if I'm not mistaken, she lived at home at least part of the time, and this was one of the roads she drove back and forth from home to the college. So, and to give you a negative example, this is a story I've told others. This happened, I don't know, 15 years ago or something, but I had a student in a class that hardly ever showed up and really didn't do much of the work. So the student failed the class. But the student came to me and was quite angry and said, "You cannot fail me." And I said, "Would you like to explain that?" And he said, "I paid for that course. And so at the very least I should have gotten a D or a D minus or something." And I said, "No, you failed." And we argued for days about that. It didn't change my mind. Clearly he did not do what he needed to do to show any kind of sense of the knowledge and the proficiency for that particular course. But to me, that was a mindset that was interesting to me, that it was very cut and dried in terms of, I paid my money, I need to get a passing grade.
The students that you remember the most, what was different about them?
What I remember the most is what they accomplished, and it was never always the same. I think in some cases it was how much they changed. In other cases, I think it was the fact that they were pretty amazing when they came here, and they got better, obviously, but in the end, I think what they created in relationship to themselves and who they were, what they did when they came here, really made me think about that. And you have to be, as a teacher, you have to be critical. You can't just give everybody a great grade, or say, everybody was here, so we should all just have, you were either here or you weren't here, kind of a grading system. Because I think it's important for people to have someone make the attempt to give them a perspective on, to the best of that instructor's ability, how they fit in with that area that they're in at that moment. And again, all students are good at some subjects and not as great in others. The system itself, on a national level, there are grades that are given to teachers. Teachers themselves are always, in a sense, being looked at, interviewed, graded. And of course that's necessary and it's good. You have professors, teachers who are better and others who are not as good. But the thing that is changing now, and I don't think it's a good thing, is the fact that the image that someone gets of a given school has more and more and more to do with statistics, or how many hours something is devoted to some particular thing. And I think the more of that happens, especially to schools and especially to faculty, is that they have to fill out more and more paperwork to satisfy the upper levels of higher education, and that kind of work takes time away from actual teaching, the interaction with a teacher and a student. And to me, that is a shame. And I think it's getting to the point now where I'm beginning to wonder, well, clearly it's part of a management philosophy, but I'm beginning to wonder why that has to happen, not so much in terms of the administration of a given school, but in terms of agencies that license schools. The whole idea of the different tiers of schools. What's a Yale compared to a Barnard, compared to some smaller school, in terms of how all of that not only plays out, but the downward pressure on the whole operation, where it actually hits, where the rubber hits the road, where the teaching is taking place between a specific teacher and a specific student. And to me, that is something that I would prefer it be reduced, it be lessened to the point where students really can get as much attention and as much of the interaction with their professors as they can. It's especially given what students have to pay these days.
So, what do you, or how do you want your teaching to be remembered?
The one thing I try not to think too much about is how other people think of me in that sense. I mean, the whole idea that I want to leave a legacy, or that I want to be remembered as something great or something, I'm not interested in that. I think the thing that, for me, is the fact that students will come back and talk to me. That they are, we developed some sort of a relationship. Now, clearly, 20 years out, I may see a person 4 times in that 20 years, but that tells me that I did something that wasn't bad. But I wouldn't go any further than that. So I just, the idea that you have enthusiasm, you have standards, you want to help, and you, in some ways, you think of the students that you've been lucky enough to have, is something that, in the end, you did help them. You did do something for them. And it's just too difficult to put that in a much more abstract way. To use the word "the best," or as long as you get to the point of good. That old adage about don't let perfection become the enemy of good is something that's always been in the back of my mind. There was, at one point, we had, I don't think they're doing them anymore, but they had situations where someone would be brought into the school and they'd try to get every single student there to talk to and listen to this person. But the tennis player, Arthur Ashe, he came here and he talked and filled the Mott Auditorium. And I'm trying to, I have it written down and it's stuck on a wall here. I want to read it rather than just try to quote it from memory. But it was pretty profound. And it was something Ash said his grandmother said to him. And she wasn't, in a sense, an academic. As far as I could tell, she wasn't, someone who's a major figure. But it sounds so abstract and so generalized, and yet when you think about it, this is really what it is about learning. Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. Do what you can. Especially that idea of use what you have and do what you can.
And so that quote there hits pretty home for you.
Oh yeah, yep. Because in one sense, and I think in terms of the context in which it was first said, it didn't have anything to do with formal education. It just had to do with somehow getting better, moving forward, being able to be successful in some way and in some situation, some context. So, I mean, in that level, it's philosophical. But on another level, it's very, very pragmatic, very instructive.
So your whole life, the art, the teaching, impact on students, everything. What's the takeaway?
Wow, it's in one sense, you could simply say it's what happened. It's something that I did this instead of something else. And, when I first started out, and talking about this, that there was no sense in my mind, and most of the people that I have that I've had experience with, it's the same thing. The idea that there is some clear, straight line in terms of one's personal history is so rare. You just never know why you ended up. I mean, there's so many thousands of things you could have done which would have changed completely what you are now, where you ended up. To even think about that and wonder, why, if I'd only done this, then this would have happened. But when you go through those straight line chains from a given point, there's so many hundreds of thousands of them, and you could have ended up so different in so many possible ways. In some ways, it's just crazy to even think about it. You did what you did, and in the end, you end up at that point. A lot of people will start out in a given major and expect that's where they're going to go, and some do. But lots of people, the road isn't straight. It takes weird quirks and changes and curves, and but it's where they are. And I guess the best advice is just enjoy what you've done, and in a sense, it's rather than thinking if I'd only done this other thing, everything would have been better. I really think that people get too involved, obsessed with that kind of thing. They're not helping themselves. There's a lot of one of the things that has always interested me is philosophy, and another thing that I think a lot about is the whole idea of consciousness. You know, why do we think and feel the way we do? What does it mean to be conscious? Those are all issues that are questions. We don't have any real answers for that yet. I mean, you have people who could be very, very religious and thinking about, I mean, you can take an extreme. You talk about something like Calvinism, where in that view, your whole life is basically set out for you ahead of time, and you are destined to go somewhere and do certain kinds of things. And then there are things like Taoism or Zen Buddhism, where you're talking about process, you're talking about how you move around, things make you move and change in certain ways, and it's a flow, it's a process. But those are to me interesting things to think about. But at a certain point, you've got to do something, you've got to be something, you've got to accomplish something. But at the same time, if you're always at that level thinking about those kinds of things, it's pretty hard to be pragmatic. It's pretty hard to actually do something. The specificity of that requirement of life in general. I mean, you got to eat, you've got to breathe, you've got to survive heat and cold and so on. So the interaction with those kinds of large forces, it's always interesting to think about things like that. And you can see how that influences cultures and nations. But again, in the end, you are somewhere, you are going or doing certain kinds of things. You live through a life, and in the end, you end up looking back on it, and you think, okay, that's what happened. It's what we did. So.
Anything else you want to add?
The one thing, well, two things. One of the things which actually Gary Wertheimer started was a book club. And the book club's been going for 35 years. And there's numbers of people in there, and they read books. And then someone will recommend a book, and then everyone reads that book and then talks about it, discusses it. And it's random in the sense you never know what someone's going to suggest you read. But the idea that in that structure, you get exposed to things that you probably wouldn't have done on your own. And that's a kind of learning. It's a kind of experiential existence, quality that I think is really good. Now, one of the things that both came out of that, both in terms of people talking about it and something that I felt I experienced, was the fact that in a small way, it's a community. It's a certain number of people who are exchanging views, talking to one another in a way that you're getting different opinions. People are saying things that are different from what you think or what you believe in. And because it's relatively small, you're literally in the same room with those people and you're talking to them. And so there's a kind of decorum, a certain kind of mannerism. You're not going to yell at someone at that level, over that kind of in that kind of a context. Small organizations, especially ones which are not really, really hierarchical, where it's all top down. There's an owner, there's a boss, and they tell everyone what to do, which in itself is sort of mythical anyway. But faculty in any given school, but as my experience here at Olivet, is the fact that they all have opinions, they all have beliefs, and so on, and they talk to one another, and they agree and disagree and argue and so on. And my experience at this place has been that the faculty, to a certain extent, have a kind of effect, influence on the whole institution that you wouldn't get from, say, employees at a large insurance company, for example, or manufacturer of some specific kind of product, so that you get kinds of structure within this institution. Like there's something, I think it's still here, called the, what's the proper term for it? It's a committee of members of the faculty who are elected by other faculty members, who in some ways talk about how you teach, how you interact with your students, whether you do the proper work, you do put in the hours in your office, etc., etc. And the whole point that I'm trying to make here is that in smaller communities where you really know everybody and you have to deal with them, you have to talk to them, the idea of getting overly emotional, getting angry with someone just doesn't work. And so you end up with a kind of group agreement about the way something ought to be handled, the way something ought to go. That doesn't happen in larger universities, can't happen. Like in any community, if you're talking about a small town electing people to run the town and what the town should do and shouldn't do, what kinds of opportunities they want to bring in and or not bring in, it's so much easier to do it in a small community, a small situation. And the more people you have, the more separated they become from one another, and it's easier to become, well, like the kind of thing we're in right now. We are in an incredibly polarized society, and in a sense, it's so much easier to shout and yell at someone you don't know. I mean, you can do it through social media, but when you start talking, and again, we've had really interesting discussions. How big of a group of people, specific individuals, how big would you want to be? Would you want that group to be in order to be able to have some say, some ability to get things the way you want them to be, or at least is somewhat the way you'd like them to be. So, I've said this in this whole discussion, this idea of small. In some ways, there's a very special thing about that.